Every day, before most of the world finishes breakfast, a single system processes more money than the entire annual GDP of Germany. Not a blockchain, not a central bank. A 50-year-old clearing network in New York called CIPS, the Clearinghouse Interbank Payments System. And the country that runs it has quietly built the most powerful financial weapon in history. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency. You've heard that before. But the dollar's dominance isn't abstract, it's mechanical. When a Japanese bank pays a Brazilian supplier in dollars, when a Korean oil company settles a cargo from the Gulf, when a European institution moves collateral across borders, almost all of it, at some point, touches American soil. That's not geography, that's architecture. To understand why, you need to know how dollar payments actually move. There are two systems. Fedwire, operated by the Federal Reserve, handles domestic transfers, large settlements between U.S. institutions. CIPS is different. Run by the Clearinghouse, a private consortium of the world's biggest banks, CIPS handles the international dollar flows, the ones that cross borders, the ones that finance global trade. Nearly 95% of payments on CIPS are the dollar leg of a cross-border transaction. A Korean shipbuilder settling a contract in Singapore dollars, an Indian exporter receiving payment from Rotterdam. Every one of those flows passes through New York. On a typical business day in 2024, settled approximately 565,000 payment orders worth an average of $1.8 trillion in a single day. By 2025, that average had climbed to $2.1 trillion per day, a 9% increase year over year. On Black Friday 2024, it broke its own record, processing over 1 million payments worth $2.63 trillion in just 24 hours. Together, CIPS and Fedwire account for roughly 96% of all large value dollar payments globally. There is no alternative infrastructure at scale. Here is what makes that number staggering. CIPS achieves it with roughly $96 billion in actual funding because its liquidity-saving algorithm allows banks to net payments against each other before final settlement. To process the same volume through a traditional payment system would require an estimated $442 billion in funding. That efficiency is not incidental. It is one of the main reasons the dollar system is so deeply embedded. Switching away from it means building that entire netting infrastructure from scratch. And this is where the choke point sharpens. The dollar's share of global trade invoicing stands at around 54%, according to IMF data. It represents 58% of global foreign exchange reserves. Over half of all SWIFT international payment messages are denominated in dollars. Every one of those transactions at some point needs to clear through a U.S. correspondent bank, a bank with a dollar account at the Fed or at CIPS. No correspondent bank, no dollar access. No dollar access, no international trade. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, carried, and every multinational corporation on Earth participates in this system not because they chose to, but because the alternative is smaller, slower, and thinner. Washington understood this long before anyone else. The mechanism is called secondary sanctions. Primary sanctions target the named entity, an Iranian bank, a Russian arms dealer. Secondary sanctions are different. They say any bank anywhere in the world that processes a transaction for that entity loses its access to the dollar system. You don't have to be American for this to apply to you. You just have to want to use dollars, which almost every major bank in the world does. In March 2012, the EU fully disconnected Iranian banks from SWIFT under U.S. pressure, a move that cost Iran roughly half its oil export revenue within months. Commercial banks globally are acutely aware of this. A single compliance failure can cost them their New York correspondent relationship, and without that relationship, they cannot process dollar transactions for any client anywhere. This is how the U.S. froze Russia out of the global financial system in 2022. Russia's central bank held roughly $300 billion in foreign reserves, much of it in European and American custody. Within days of the Ukraine invasion, those assets were frozen. Russia was cut off from SWIFT. Its correspondent banking relationships evaporated. In the span of a week, one of the world's largest economies was functionally locked out of international trade. The ruble fell 30% against the dollar in days. Import prices spiked. Russian companies that needed dollars to service foreign currency debt found themselves stranded. Iran has been living this reality for decades. North Korea, too. When the Treasury issues a sanctions designation, the target doesn't need to be in America, own anything in America, or have ever done business with an American. They just need to use dollars, and that means they need CIPS, and CIPS is in New York, and New York follows Treasury orders. Russia has spent 3 years since 2022 building evasion networks, shadow fleets, third-country intermediaries, barter arrangements, borrowing from Iran's long, refined playbook. But evasion is not the same as replacement. It is a tax paid in friction and discounts. On every transaction that has to move outside the system, the rest of the world has noticed. Carried China's CIPS system, cross-border interbank payment system, processed roughly 180 trillion yuan, equivalent to about $26 trillion in 2025, from 175 trillion yuan in 24. Participation has grown to over 500 institutions across 124 countries. Russia has shifted over 90% of its trade with China to yuan, according to Kremlin data. The yuan's share of global SWIFT payments stood at around 3% in mid-2025 versus 48% for the dollar and 24% for the euro. The euro's share of SWIFT payments sits at 22%. The renminbi at roughly 3 to 4%, growing but starting from nearly zero a decade ago. But here's the structural reality that no alternative has yet overcome. CIPS handles about $26 trillion a year. CIPS handles that amount in roughly 13 days. The depth of dollar markets, the liquidity of U.S. treasuries, the breadth of dollar-denominated commodity contracts. These aren't switching costs. They're a gravitational field built over 80 years. Oil is still priced in dollars. Most commodity futures trade in dollars. The U.S. Treasury market, $27 trillion outstanding, is the world's deepest pool of liquid collateral. No other sovereign bond market comes close. The dollar's chokehold is not a policy, it's an infrastructure. Every country that wants to trade internationally must either use that infrastructure, on America's terms, or build a parallel system large enough to replace it. So far, no country has come close, and the more Washington uses this weapon, the more countries notice. That is the paradox. Each sanctions episode is also a recruitment drive for the alternatives. Enough of those recruitment drives, and the alternatives start to matter. That has not happened yet, and until it does, one country controls the toll booth for global commerce. Not with armies, with a clearing network in Manhattan.